Okay, so I want to welcome everyone. This is the first How We Listen um, event for the Oral History Archives at Columbia. And the purpose of the event was wanting just to find out, how do people use podcasting, but also oral histories, because the Oral History Archive, as you might guess, is very concerned with like collecting things and preserving them. And we do have researchers and like people from all over the world who use the archives, but we don't get a good sense of that being on this side of the archival desk. And sometimes when, we have interviews from decades ago that are thousands of page long and like hours of tape, I'm like, is anybody really listening to this? So I was really intrigued by like trying to start a series of events where we look at how people have used oral histories. And so I am really pleased to welcome you, Clarissa Redwine, as our inaugural guest.
I'm so excited to be here. Yeah, and talk at length with you.
Cool. So before we start all of that, I wanted to give a land acknowledgement and solidarity statement. So I want to start by acknowledging that Columbia University sits on Lenape-Hoking land, which is the ancestral home of the Lenni Lenape people. And in the Unami dialect, Lenni Lenape means human beings or the real people. The Munsee band of Lenape lived where Columbia is presently located in Upper Manhattan. So despite dispersal to other territories, the Lenni Lenape people are part of the past, present, and future knowledge and well-being of this place. So we're compelled to support organizations and movements that center Indigenous people. So to that end, I'd like to encourage everyone to sign the petition appealing to the New York City government to recognize Indigenous Peoples Day, because who needs Columbus Day? I will put that link in the chat. And then also to sign a petition, or actually to learn more about the Indigenous Peoples Day Committee. So both of those links are in the chat and also easily searchable on the web. And also, since we'll be discussing collective action and solidarity today, I'd encourage you to read a poem by Nate Marshall. It's called Landless Acknowledgement, and put that link in the chat as well. And I offer this poem to us for us to consider the interconnections between Indigenous and Black struggle, and also what that means for how we are implicated in and resist colonial settlerism. So that link is in the chat also for Nate Marshall's poem. Thank you for your attention. Okay, so, well, there are very few of us here. we had some icebreakers and things to sort of prime participation. But I think actually what we'll do is, Clarissa, why don't you tell us how you came to do the podcast?
Yeah, it was actually kind of a surprise opportunity. So I was invited to be an NYU fellow, and I specifically was invited to sort of do research on open source hardware and learn the current state of the open source hardware community and sort of what some of the major challenges for that community are. And I, one day at our fellows meeting, I think it was the meeting that was right after the lockdown, right after the shutdown. And no one had anything to talk about. All the fellows were like, the world's wild right now. Like, we just have nothing to talk about. And someone sort of turned to me on Zoom and was like, hey, do you want to just tell us like casually what happened at Kickstarter? And so I was like, sure, yeah. And I dove into this like hour and a half long chat about all the things that we experienced and some of the like major learnings. And it was such a visceral experience for all of us organizing that I just needed no prep at all to launch into that. Yeah, and after that, my advocate at NYU was like, hey, do you want to do a larger project around this? And I was like, yeah, that would be amazing to have funding and support to capture that story. But first I was like, hold on, I don't know if it's possible. Let me go talk to my other organizers and see if they would be interested in lending their voices to the project. And call after call, I would sort of explain what I was thinking, like maybe an oral history, something where we're all telling the story together. And every single one of my fellow organizers was like, hell yes, let's do this. Like, I would love to be involved. And that's how it really got rolling. Yeah.
So this was a project then that wasn't at all, well, was it related to your original project that you were doing about open source, just in terms of like ethos or anything?
I mean, I think people who value open source and value that sort of like knowledge creation and knowledge sharing also value the idea of unions and how workers can have their labor valued. And, it's sort of connected. The ethos is connected, but no, there was no real connection between the projects. It was just sort of a spur of the moment offer from NYU.
So did you end up doing the original project, or did you switch to the podcast entirely?
Yeah. So I sort of wrote the report and the sort of investigation of open source hardware. It's the current state of open source hardware. Finished that up and started doing interviews for the oral history. Yeah.
Okay. And had you done a podcast before?
No, I had not. A few years ago, I got really excited about the idea of a podcast that would touch on the connection between science and creativity. And so I had sort of like thought about doing that for a while, but never got serious about it. Yeah, but gosh, telling the story of the union drive through the voices of the organizers was just such a perfect fit that, yeah, I decided this is the direction we're going to take this project. Yeah.
And so who was on the team for creating the podcast?
So it's really me.
Team me.
I mean, I write it, I produce it, and I sort of voice the narration. But there are so many people who help out. Like I'll call people who were former organizers into my script that I'm writing and say like, hey, will you read through this and let me know what you think? I'd love feedback. And there have been people who've given me audio files from us, like, singing karaoke or like leaked audio, obviously.
There was a lot of great audio in there.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, I was personally shocked to learn how much people were recording. I think it just like really showed the lack of trust that people had for management and the system that we were all in. If I had known that many people were recording, I would have also been recording my conversations, but I just didn't think to do it.
Right.
Yeah, but yeah, and then also I've got to say my advocate at NYU, who's the executive director of the Engelberg Center, Michael Weinberg, he's the one who sort of said, hey, you seem passionate about this. Let's give you funding to do a big project. And he also does pretty deep like editing sweeps on my scripts and helps a lot there. So I would say like we're the core team. Yeah.
And they'd already had they had a podcast before the Engelberg Center?
Yeah, actually they did. And the Engelberg Center is mostly focused on law and how it sort of relates to innovation. And this podcast, like this project kind of fit into that realm that they're exploring because it does have an effect on the way that tech companies operate and the way that innovation is generated. So that's sort of how it fit in.
Cool. I'm asking all these questions because it's really well produced, and I'm not just like blowing smoke because, and also like your narration is great. I worked in public radio for a while, and like did a podcast, a very short podcast. And even though there's like a podcast boom and like the tools are democratized, all podcasts are not the same. They're not of the same quality. I'm just going to put that out there. And so I was just really impressed with like your delivery and like the pacing of the script. And like I can remember like listening to like certain episodes and where I was like walking into a doctor's office and be like, wait, I'm gonna hang out on the sidewalk so I can finish listening to this.
Amazing.
So I think it's really like good on you. It's really well done. And two, there's, I think we'll get into some of these things in a bit, but just like if there were any sort of conflicts that came up for you having been personally involved in it and then trying to narrate, but we'll come to that in a second. So,
well, I really appreciate that. Thank you so much for saying that. It did take a lot of time and effort to learn all these tools, and
yeah,
it's just nice to hear.
Yeah, and I'm sure it wasn't easy. I think it's kind of like when people like say like athletes have a natural gift or something. It's like, well, don't downplay like all the skill and the practice that it takes to put something together. So
yeah.
So we thought we'd talk about tech unionization generally to start, and because it seems like there's a lot of it right now, but was Kickstarter the first tech company to unionize?
It kind of depends. Like there was a group of workers in a location in Pittsburgh that were contract workers for Google, but their direct employer was HCL. Which is like a contractor for Google.
Okay.
And they unionized. So they were sort of like like a location that unionized. It wasn't the whole company. And it was primarily contractors. Kickstarter was the first full, like company-wide, full-time tech worker union. Yeah.
Okay. And I think it's important to make that distinction between like full-time employees for a company and contractors. And like, can you just tease out like what the difference would be there in terms of the significance of the unionization?
Yeah, it's actually really interesting. So the National Labor Relations Act and the way that the National Labor Relations Board governs labor issues, it usually in a company, like take Google, for example, if the Google workers, which they have created a union, under the United States labor law, they cannot include workers who are not full-time or who are international. So contractors are actually excluded from the bargaining unit. So it's really interesting, like the way that HCL, that contractor union, unionized was kind of special because they were a group that would normally be excluded from the bargaining unit of the core company that they give work to,
Okay.
And then Kickstarter was all full-time workers and did not spend time trying to organize people who were contractors or part-time workers because they wouldn't legally be counted in a vote. So it's like an interesting mesh, but I think it's really exciting to see what Google is doing, because they are saying, we don't care what the rules are. We are going to create a union that is strong because we're inviting everyone. We're a wall-to-wall union. And I just thought that was so inspiring and special and something new.
Interesting. So wall-to-wall means they're including sort of all types of workers.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. How did you learn all of these like terms and concepts? Like, was it during the process of organizing? Because I think of there being like generational differences between like what people know about unions and their experience with them. So like boomers having, a lot of them maybe having come up through unions, and then Gen X people maybe like we had great insurance growing up because our parents were in unions, so we might have taken it for granted a bit. And then I just didn't really think about like how later generations learn about unions, particularly with sort of national drives to try to kill the labor movement.
Yeah. I mean, a couple of years ago, I knew nothing about unions. Like I learned everything through the process and really from the people around me who had a lot more knowledge. All the voices you hear in the oral history, that's sort of like a I guess like an example of what I was going through every day as part of the union drive. Like people were just like throwing out terms and concepts that I had never encountered before. And I think you're right. I think that a lot of people like around my age and also a lot of people in tech specifically have not really encountered what unions can do. And that's not by accident. Like tech has tried very, very hard to keep unions out of the industry from the beginning. And we could talk about that a little bit more too, if you want.
Sure. Yeah, I'm interested. 'Cause I didn't know that.
Yeah. I mean, like all the things that we sort of like equate with tech culture, like free lunches, wearing whatever you want. Oh, the boss is your pal. Like, all of those sort of cultural things that we think of as part of like a hip tech company. Those are all decisions made by people in management to help the workplace feel less formal so that you don't think of yourself as a worker in traditional power structures, which you are. You are a worker in traditional power structures where you could be fired at any time for almost any reason. So yeah, so these are all like strategic moves from tech to keep workers from feeling the limitations of their roles.
That is very interesting because I was like, what is all this ping pong about? And why are people so excited to be able to like never leave the office? And I remember once taking a tour, I think of Google in Manhattan, and just being like, why do you want to sleep here? I don't understand. Why do you want to live here? So interesting.
Yeah.
So it's all very sort of strategic in that way.
Yeah. If you think about like the sort of meritocracy culture, the individualism, like, oh, you can climb the ranks. All you have to do is be a good coder. Yeah, all of these things that sort of are traditionally used to allow people with power to centralize that power and the knowledge of what salary everyone is making, who's happy, who's unhappy. Like when you get workers to not talk to each other, that's when you have the most power as an employer. So all of these like somewhat subtle, soft cultural things of, crunch or working 24/7, all of those things are strategically meant to sort of undermine any opportunity a worker would have to talk to another worker about a problem, yeah, but
So
it's an
calling it like
interesting.
people, whatever, like
Yes.
officer of happiness and all these like making up your title and all of these things are kind of
Yeah.
just a smoke screen for a lack of structure and consolidations of power in particular places.
Yeah. I mean, even
Huh.
things like employee resource groups or groups that the company lifts up as examples of uh oh yeah, in the audio industry. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Yeah, but like there are so many groups that HR and the company sort of like applauds, but they don't get any real power to make any real changes. These are all like strategic plays. They're not just out of the goodness of HR's hearts.
Yeah, I'm seeing
Yeah.
a lot of parallels too, like Jenny was mentioning in the chat between like different industries, and because I'm thinking about like 'cause Gimlet is trying to unionize. I don't know if they have already.
Yeah, I don't know if they're negotiating a contract or
Right,
yeah.
StoryCorps unionized.
Yeah.
So yeah, I see all of these different parallels there in like cultures and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Well, why don't we sort of slide into talking about Kickstarter United specifically, because like you mentioned, I was just re-listening to the podcast and I can't keep people's names straight, even though I like wrote them down. Like some people I can like pick out, but someone mentioned, maybe it was Danelle, maybe, about going to undergrad and not thinking that they would ever end up at a tech company because they had like a different set of skills, sounded like maybe like arts and humanities based. So I'm wondering if amongst the unionizers, there were like commonalities in terms of like where people came from, like
Yeah.
educationally or experientially, or if they were artists that helped with bringing people together for the organizing.
Yeah. I think you're talking about Trav.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
Okay.
yeah. So, yeah, that was an interesting thing about Kickstarter. Kickstarter was sort of a company that cherished creativity and really celebrated people who worked at the company having creative work outside of their day jobs. And I think there are so many people in tech that do so many different roles. It's not just all engineers.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is that we think of a tech worker as being this like privileged, highly paid worker that gets to play ping pong and gets free food, but
Right.
that's not really the reality of a lot of workers in tech. Like there are a lot of customer support or trust and safety workers that get paid significantly less than other
Hmm.
tech workers who are in technical roles. And Kickstarter did have a team that was sort of like split of these technical workers who worked on the second floor, and then the non-technical workers who mainly worked on the, basement floor. And
Really, it was
yeah,
just that bold geographically in the
it was actually
building.
one of the people who contributed to the podcast, Carly. She was talking about it, and I was like, I've never realized before that it was so split up. And she was like, oh my gosh, day one I walked through the door and I noticed that split, and I was like, oh, I had never noticed it before. That being said, Kickstarter is a beautiful building. The basement is still beautiful. But anyway, but I think one thing that helped catalyze the union drive was workers who were at what some people would consider the lowest rung of the company. They were trust and safety workers who got paid some of the lowest salaries. They were also, the trust and safety team was also the most diverse team at Kickstarter, with the most
Mm-hmm.
like gender diversity and racial diversity of all kinds of different backgrounds. And that was on purpose so that these people could think critically about the rules that Kickstarter was operating under.
Uh-huh.
And because they have to like look at all different kinds of projects and sort of like suss out, is this project dangerous for the community, or is this project punching up, speaking truth to power sort of thing. So that team actually really led the catalytic event of the union drive, where they basically blew the whistle on a bad call from management, where management saw Breitbart write a story about one of our comic books projects called Always Punch Nazis. And management was like, oh, we don't want any trouble. We don't want any press about this. Let's just cancel the projects. And the trust and safety team said, this project is punching up. We don't believe it breaks our rules. We think this is a bad call. And management just steamrolled right over them. And so that team actually orchestrated this collective action event where they called management out and said, this isn't right. And all the employees from all around the company came together to stand up to that decision from management. And that was the moment where I think workers really started to understand their collective power. And yeah, that was like one of the first tangible instances of organizing at Kickstarter.
So the always punch Nazis, was that?
Always punch Nazis, yeah.
And then also the drip project, it seemed like those were the two like inciting incidents for organizing, and also they kind of helped to drive the story in the podcast as well.
You're right. Yeah. And that's drip is actually, so the story with drip is that management at Kickstarter, there had been longstanding unrest in the Kickstarter team of how many projects and features and things that could really help the community get like bubble up through the ranks. You know, engineers are excited about them. Outreach team members are excited about these features. And then once they hit a certain level of management, either, you know, senior leadership would say that's just not the direction we want to take, or that's just not cool enough, you know, very soft answers that weren't satisfying to the workers. And drip was one of the biggest examples of this existing tension within Kickstarter, where all of the engineers and designers and, you know, it was hands on deck to create this tool called Drip, which was kind of like Kickstarter, but instead of funding for one big project, you have a subscription model where people pay you like $5 a month or something to continue your podcast or your video series, whatever. And people were really excited about that, that tool, because there were so many creators that were doing amazing work, but didn't need funding in large chunks. They needed sustained funding. So it was very near and dear to the hearts of the people who really care about the creators at Kickstarter. And a lot of people put in a lot of hours, a lot of effort. The timelines were short. And one day management just made the announcement that they were no longer going to keep supporting this product, and they were actually going to basically give it away. That's something that we don't really talk about in the podcast, but they basically paid another group a significant amount of money as like seed funding to take this product off of their hands and continue to develop it. And everyone at Kickstarter was just flabbergasted and upset that that would happen. So that's another inciting moment, where people were like, we just can't let management make all the decisions. So
right. So at base, the like the using those things as kind of sort of movement towards unionization was about like where decision making lies in the organization.
Exactly. It was this, I think both of those situations, the Always Punch Nazis and Drip, the dismantling of Drip, those were both very clear instances where all the power rested in just a few people's hands at the top. And it was hurting not only the workers, but the community of Kickstarter, which everyone who worked at Kickstarter really cared about. So it was moments where we glimpsed the structure of power at Kickstarter.
It revealed itself.
Yeah.
So I want to zoom out just a little bit to get an idea of the timeline. Like what's the timeline that the podcast covers?
Oh my God, I'm so bad with dates. I might be terrible about this.
Like I heard, September 20, I'm getting confused about the dates, but I don't know if it was like 2015 or 2017.
No. So I'm pretty sure that Always Punch Nazis was in like fall 2018.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and then I'm pretty sure that's right. and then the Union Drive was about a year, like from that time for about a year after.
So the Union Drive took about a year.
Yeah, I would say a year and a half if we're counting the vote, the actual like vote count, where it was officially decided that the union was recognized. But yeah, I'm so terrible. People ask me that all the time and I always forget. So
I usually have like an Evernote somewhere around that's like just dates of things because I can never keep them in my head.
I need that.
Because I was wondering about the timeline because I was going to ask you how you decided how you're going to do the podcast in terms of story. Like, did you decide you're gonna like do a 3-act structure, or how did you decide how many episodes you were going to do?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I one of the first people that I talked to about the structure of the story was Taylor, who we hear a lot from on the
Mhm.
podcast. Yeah, he's like
Taylor's a great storyteller.
he is. He's a comedian. He tells great stories. Like yeah. And so I reached out to him saying like, hey, how should I do this? And he suggested a 3-act structure. And I originally planned the podcast with that in mind. Like I sort of wrote out what each act within each. There were 3 acts for the entire series, and then there were also 3 acts within each episode. But to be honest, I just totally scrapped that structure as I was writing the scripts. And I just gave things the time that I thought they needed. Yeah, like there are some episodes where a huge portion of the episode is maybe an hour. Like this latest episode, I think half the time of the entire episode is people talking about an hour at the NLRB office when the votes were counted. So I didn't really stick to an act structure. I know that's a blasphemy, but
no, I guess that's part of the evolution of podcasting. I think is part of it, is that there aren't really any rules. And I think that's just having been in public radio and watching some public radio stations dilly-dally about getting into it, was they were like, well, how is this radio, or how do we fit what we're already doing into this, as opposed to thinking about this is a new thing and how can we sort of free ourselves up to be creative in how we tell stories in it.
Yeah.
But yet I still felt like you had cliffhangers.
I know.
You had cliffhangers, and then there were a couple times where you're like, the pace, we're going to change the pace of this and not drop episodes every. I was like, excuse me? Like I had paid good money to listen to this free podcast.
Oh my God. I mean, that's actually, that's something that I can definitely give as a piece of advice. Like when I started this, I basically had the acts planned out. Like I had generally where I thought, you know, which episodes would hold which stories and which major events, how we would split those major events up over episodes. I sort of had that general feeling. But I had done none of the podcast creation, like none of the audio episode creation until after we announced the podcast.
Wait a minute. Wait, say that again.
Like, yeah, I think best practice would be to maybe make like half of the episodes before you announce the podcast, or before you release the first episode. But every episode that gets released, the next one is not created yet. So so I sort of have to create the episode as we go along, which has been kind of good because I get responses from people and I'm like, oh, okay, I know how to tweak the next episode to make something more clear or to focus on something. But that also means that I'm like chasing to get the next episode done.
Right.
Which is why we changed our cadence a couple times. I was just like, it's not done yet. I don't know.
There is a comment in the chat about how stressful.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Yeah, but I'm super lucky that that my advocate at NYU, Michael, he at a certain point he was like, hey, you know, if you need to take an extra week, just do it. It's fine. And I was like, well, thank God. So yeah.
So that's how the pacing changes kind of early on, and then around the holidays, I think, right?
Yeah, around the holidays is when I was moving from Brooklyn to Asheville, and yeah, we just took a bunch of time off then. I don't even know how many weeks it was, but yeah, I hope people aren't too upset about it.
No, because it comes back and it's great. So, but it's always like waiting for like, there are like these unexpected cliffhangers in it. Yeah. So I mentioned the podcast to a friend, and I think her partner works in tech, and she's like, wait a minute, do they talk about and I couldn't find the episode. I was going to try to find the audio for today, but like where management hired, it was like a weird party or something.
I mean, there were lots of weird parties at
Or they
Kickstarter.
hired,
Are
or
you
there were
talking
people in
about the?
costumes. Were they throwing stuff at people?
Yes, you are talking about the dinosaurs in the office.
Yes.
Which, I mean, gosh, it's so sad. I feel like it was a well-intentioned stunt. Like, this comes back to Drip, where
Uh-huh.
everyone was working toward a deadline for Drip.
Hmm.
And then we also were hosting this conference in the office. So every single worker at Kickstarter was just sprinting to hit this deadline,
Uh-huh.
two separate deadlines, basically. And the day of the big conference that we were hosting, just a few hours before creators started to show up to the office, they had these people in dinosaur costumes come through, and people thought it was like pretty funny. Like they thought it was like somewhat humorous. But there were some people who were just like, I am so busy with this deadline. How can you do this to me? And then to top it off, they had like a big brass band come through the office and play all of their instruments super loud, and it was meant to be like exciting, like, hey, we hit this deadline, we're excited, but no one had hit the deadline yet, so
What
it
are we
was like,
celebrating?
yeah, it was like you could tell that it was like meant to be a morale booster, but
Yeah.
that's not how you boost morale. Like, it's sort of a band-aid for it. So yeah.
So when it comes to weird episodes like that, because you said people were recording on their own, but then when it comes to telling stories about things like that happened, like did you know there were certain stories that you wanted in the podcast that you had to just figure out like who remembers it best and has the best retelling of it?
Yeah, there was a little bit of that where I definitely had certain people I knew would be good at telling certain stories. But then there was a lot of just discovery of what people remembered, like specifically talking about the dinosaur incident. Sarah, one of the other people who contributed to the podcast, she described that as being like one of the scariest days of her life, because it was shortly after a big shooting event in Las Vegas. And she just saw like people sort of like commotion on the other side of the
Uh-huh.
building, and people holding like big metal objects in front of them. And she just explained the fear in a way that I wasn't expecting to hear from her. And yeah, there were a lot of times where it was just a surprise. Like, another time that there was a surprising story was, someone who contributed anonymously to the podcast. They put us in touch. We really had worked not too much together before they left Kickstarter.
Mhm.
Um, and this person described a story of reporting harassment to management, and management bringing in the legal team and bringing in the HR team and just sort of taking everything out of her control.
Hmm.
She simply came to management to say, hey, I had this weird experience. Like, I've worked through it with the person, but it seems like we should have more processes in place to sort of help facilitate like healing around this. And HR was like, well, we've got to report this. Like, we've got to make this a big deal. We have to reach out to the other person to hear their side of the story. Like, it just became a very
Hmm.
scary situation for her that she wasn't expecting.
Hmm.
And that was a story I had never heard at Kickstarter. So
Wow.
yeah.
So is that the oral history? Like why did you think of this as an oral history project as opposed to like a podcast that uses interviews? Like why is oral history important to it?
Yeah. Well, the thing I really liked about oral history is I feel like it's a moment where people who maybe are not in positions of power to enforce a narrative get a chance to share their stories. And we had so many situations where Kickstarter's PR team, and their PR agency that they hired would just come in and erase all memory of these really difficult events that happened at Kickstarter where they just objectively fought the union, you know. And I thought an oral history would be a good way to retell this story in a way that sort of honored that tradition of raising up the voices of people who are not in positions of power. And then also the podcast version of the oral history was just supposed to be one component. I I had been sitting down with people and having interviews that go to like 3 hours. Some are like 6 hours long. They're very long sessions that include like lots of crying and laughing and yeah, all the emotions. And I was originally thinking I would just sanitize those so that there were no names mentioned or no identifying information and share those raw. That was sort of a big part of the project. But as I started doing these interviews and listening to the stories, it was just such a beautiful, but it felt like people were talking to each other, you know, like people would tell the same story and they would sort of like pick up where someone else left off, but not knowing that they were doing that, you know? And so that's when the sort of podcast started, part of the story or part of the project started to take a larger shape, you know? Yeah, it was just sort of like an organic exploratory process. Yeah.
And I think I like the word organic there, because I think in one of the sort of pre-episodes where you're describing the podcast, you talk about like it's a chorus of voices. And I was like, that is a beautiful way to describe what happens and how people tell this story. And so it feels like even though you're the main voice and like producing and writing the scripts, it does feel like very much like a collective effort in telling the story. So.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, people donated so much of their time to do this. Yeah. And also I started this exercise like in early April, I think, of last year, sort of doing the interviews and gathering. And I was asking people to do their interviews under little blanket forts to like get the best audio. And as we moved into the summer, that became a bigger and bigger ask. So not only did people spend a lot of time with me, they also spent a lot of time in a hot like oven of blankets. So.
A little hut,
yes.
recording hut.
Yes, it was definitely a group effort. Yeah.
Cool. So you mentioned like with the longer ones, you thought maybe you would sort of sanitize and edit for names. So can you talk about some of the privacy and security issues that might have arisen?
Yeah. I got some help from the folks at the sort of audio oral history center at NYU. They gave me like some resources to look over about how oral history is usually, like, the security and privacy concerns are usually conducted. And that included things like, of course, allowing the participants to have control over what's shared, you know, like they get final say. So I took some of those learnings and sort of tweaked them for my own use. So the way that our privacy works is when I get on the phone with someone, I say like, okay, I'm going to go through our privacy, procedures. And the things that I tell them is, one, they get total control over everything that's shared. So I send them a cut of their full interview or specific clips that I would like to use in the oral history podcast. And they get to say, oh, I don't like, the way that I said that, let's scrap that. Or I don't like that you can sort of tell who I'm talking about here, let's scrap that. Or they say like, can you just cut half of this clip out? Like they get incredible control over what's being shared. And then also I struck a deal with NYU where I knew that we were going to be talking about very sensitive things, and I wanted people to be very comfortable talking about everything that was on their mind. So I have this thing where I am the only person who hears the raw interviews.
Mhm.
And the only instance where someone other than me would hear a raw interview is if, for some reason, Kickstarter sued NYU, and then NYU's lawyers would review the interview. But other than that, it's like total privacy. So when we're having a conversation, we are the only two people who know what happened in that full conversation, if that makes sense.
Mhm. And so are those interviews going to go into NYU's archive, or is that not happening? Because I'm thinking just about access to them and like how like archivists and librarians prioritize patron access to materials.
Yeah, that's actually something that I'm still considering right now, because I feel like the podcast covered so much of the experience that we had that maybe it might not be necessary to share the full interviews,
Mhm.
because there comes a lot of risk with sharing the full interviews. So I might talk to participants and say, hey, how would you feel if we shared this like a little, like a couple years from now, or shared a more
Mm.
sanitized version or something? um, but I'm kind of thinking maybe I'll do it if someone asks for it. I don't know. That's still something I'm sort of
Well,
trying to
yeah, because
wrestle
you're
with.
still making the podcast, right? Will there be one more episode?
There's one more. There's one more. So
Just
I need to
one
figure it
more.
out. Yeah.
Well, but I mean, you don't actually have to figure out like that archival aspect. The preservation part of me says, just make sure you are saving
Yeah.
3 separate copies of them in 3 separate places.
Yep. I have big hard drives that several copies are on, and also
Nice.
a cloud version. Yeah.
Cool. Um, what else did I want to ask about? Because we've covered a lot of what I wanted to talk about. Let's see. Oh, just in terms of the voices that we hear, I'm wondering if there were, like, how you considered who gets heard in the podcast, particularly, and like not replicating those structures of marginalization that might have been evident in the workplace, or so how did you negotiate that, both maybe, I don't know if it's too big of a question to say in the organizing of the union and also in the podcast. So maybe if you just wanted to talk about the podcast part.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like we were really lucky in the union to have a few people who had organizing experience, not union organizing, but they had done community organizing
Uh-huh.
before. So they already knew how easy it is for collectives and union groups to sort of fall into those structures of like oppression and like systemic racism and systemic sexism, how you can sort of replicate those in your organizing work. So they were very intentional from the beginning to set up processes and like helpful structures, and also like outreach methods to include voices that are historically like marginalized. And
Mhm.
and so luckily whenever I was making the podcast, we had a union that was already like pretty inclusive. I mean, of course it could have been better, but yeah, I feel like other people did a lot of work to make that group inclusive. So whenever I was pulling from voices from that group, it was easier for me to make sure that there was a lot of different perspectives. And um, yeah, but one thing that I think is sort of something that I'm not sure if this was good or not, but I sort of made the decision not to include the voices of people who were anti-union. So no
Let's
one
talk about
in
that.
yeah, no one in the podcast it was anti-union. Everyone was either pro-union or a core organizer. And a part of that was just, I knew I was going to be spending a lot of time talking to these people. And I wanted to talk to people who were not like honestly triggering for me. Like I had
Mhm.
very difficult experiences at Kickstarter with the people who were anti-union, and
Mhm.
I just didn't want to have to deal with that. So, but at the same time, like I also wanted to be mindful of the whole reason that I sort of looked up to the oral history tradition, and like I said before, like raising up voices that are not in positions of power, or not reinforcing power structures that hurt marginalized people and workers in general. And so I kind of thought, like, we don't need to include their voices. Like, that's not what this project is about. It's about sharing the perspectives of organizers and people who are fighting to make the workplace more equitable.
Mhm.
Yeah, so that was like an editorial decision, I guess, and I'm not sure how people feel about it, or yeah, but
Well, it taps into sort of like two related questions I had, which was actually one is a statement, one is a question. So I don't believe in objectivity, and I don't think like podcasting necessarily has that ruse or veneer of being objective that journalism has.
yeah.
So based on that, like you've talked about that editorial decision. So based on that though, because you were involved with the organizing, and like there's a recently one of the vote episode where you talk about going to cast your vote.
Oh yeah.
My heart was pounding, so I was so nervous for you. How did you take care of, how do you take care of yourself in the process of making a podcast that's so close to your, like it is your personal experience?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, I mean, around objectivity, like it was so funny because my advocate at NYU, who has been really helpful through this whole process and kicked off the whole opportunity to capture this story,
Mhm.
when he read the script for the first episode and was giving feedback, he kept seeing that I was using the word like I and we, and he was like, you might want to like step back from that and make it a little bit more objective and tell the story from like this omniscient vantage point. And I was like, I felt like that was kind of disingenuous to do that. Like, I clearly have a
Mm,
perspective. I'm clearly telling the story for a reason as well.
mm,
Like,
mhm,
I want people to identify with us and with these union organizers so that they can see union organizers are just like them, like, and share a lot of the joys and struggles that they share as well. And so I pushed back on that, and I'm so glad that I did. I'm so glad that I told the story, um, and was sort of unapologetic about being part of the story as well. And
mhm,
not only do I think that's more truthful, but I also think that it's very unique. It's unique to have someone telling the story who like is acting as the producer, who was also on the ground with the people who, yeah, were organizing. So yeah, I'm so glad I did. And as far as like caring for myself, oh my gosh, I I was actually really surprised that I had the courage to say that I felt like I might not be able to go in that day and vote.
uh-huh.
Um, yeah, I don't know if you remember in the episode, but there was this union meeting where I was like, y'all, I don't think I can do it. I really don't think I can physically walk into the building without fainting.
Uh-huh. Yep.
And even telling them that, I was like shaking and my face is all red. And I'm so glad I told them that and actually like admitted that sort of fear that I had, because they totally helped me through it. All the other organizers like surrounded me in a little pod and walked me up. And then, as you know, we ran into the general
General
counsel.
counsel in the elevator.
That was wild. That was wild. And okay, something I left out of the episode, which I find hilarious, was that I had told myself, like, if I go in here, I definitely won't be able to speak. Like, I definitely won't be able to do that. And when we got in the elevator and the general counsel was like, what are you doing here? Everyone else that was my bubble was silent. Like, that moment where I was like, I'm here to vote. I have the right to vote. It was not me being like defiant or brave. It was me going, no one else is going to say anything. I've got to say something. So it was quite
It could
silly.
be that nobody else was going to say anything and you were being defiant and brave.
Yeah, well, but I had to ask people in the interviews, I had to ask other people to tell that story because I had blacked out, like I couldn't remember at all. So
Uh-huh.
yeah,
Wow.
that was so
Yeah.
funny though. Yeah.
There's that moment, and then when they go to deliver, I think it was deliver the letter to general counsel and they wouldn't take the letter. I was like, oh, my insides, I just feel frozen.
Oh, I have heard about that secondhand because that was after I had been fired for organizing,
Uh,
and yeah, it just sounded awful. It just sounded so awkward. And at NYU, I'm part of the like legal fellows group, so almost everyone else is a lawyer. And I
uh-huh.
basically asked the group, like, is this a normal strategy? And they were like, no, that's wild. It's wild that he would do that. Oh, so silly.
I think that's silly. Just Shaw. But I think
It is.
but I think that's the great one of the great things about the podcast and doing oral history is that there's a lot that's generalizable and that one can learn about union organizing, and also the ways that management will try to retaliate and block unions, because I don't know if we have such great accounting in popular culture of that part.
Yeah.
But then there's also, excuse me, also like you're saying, like things that are very distinctive to what happened at Kickstarter.
Yeah.
So yeah, they come together really well in the package.
Yeah. I don't know about you, but I've been just like glued to my screen with the Amazon warehouse workers unionizing in Bessemer. Like, oh my God, the things that they have to deal with are so, I feel like a lot of the things that we dealt with, except for the firings, were very subtle or very like purposely subtle acts of, retaliation or anti-union rhetoric. But like the workers in Bessemer have had like the stoplight outside of their. Have you heard about the stoplight?
No.
Okay, let me know if this is too off topic because I can stop now.
Let's go.
Okay.
Let's go. Because I wanted to
So-
ask about sort of like what's general, like what advice would you give or what have you noticed? So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're really lucky that all of these things that are going on in Bessemer are getting captured and shared on like social media and in video and in these really like rich ways. Like for instance, workers would stand outside of the warehouse, down near the street, like where the main entrance and exit is, onto the street. And there's a little stoplight there. And whenever it was a red light, workers would sort of walk out and be like, hey, fellow worker, have you heard about the union? We would love you to vote yes. Just doing simple organizing before people go home. And Amazon rang up the local government and they were like, hey, can you alter the traffic light pattern so that the red light is quicker? So that people don't have enough time. And workers were telling reporters this, and reporters were like, okay, I'll write it down. Like allegedly that they've tampered with the stoplights, and they confirmed it. It's true. And just
how did they confirm it? Like with somebody with the city or freedom of information or something?
Yeah, something like that. But I mean, that is wild. I just find all of these stories so fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, because it seems like with the way that you tell the story with Kickstarter management, it's a weird analogy, but I'm just kind of obsessed with like reports about like harassment and things where the man involved needs to seem like a good guy. There's like this weird, and it seems like there was some of that happening with like the management or the leadership of Kickstarter really just wanted to seem like good guys and really wanted everybody to like them, but also needed to stop this union. So, and then like, But then there's like also psychotic people out there who might do things like tamper with public safety to get their way. So
Yeah. That's a really good point. That happened all the time.
Jenny, you have a question?
I do. Hi, thank you so much I feel so special. I get to watch this, hear it. I was like biking, listening. I was like, oh yeah, shit. Like, I need to listen to this podcast. And you just were talking about like other union struggles, but I just wonder, I can't believe how many parallels there are. And like, I feel like every time I think about leaving journalism and leaving audio specifically, people are always like, it's just as bad everywhere else. Like, don't forget. Or just like, don't think that it's just audio, right? Like that all these structures or like all the harmful systems we work with are the water we swim in. And so we don't like lose it because we leave radio. But I'm really interested in hearing a little bit more about like what it is like to create, like as a reporter, I so rarely create work that is like centered on an experience that I've had. And when I do, I feel so deeply uncomfortable. And so I wonder like if you had any thoughts or specific examples about navigating and negotiating that with people that you have these really intimate interactions with that you've like already known for so long. I have only done like one piece in the last couple years where I'm like talking to people I love and then like doing some of that negotiation where you're like sending them their stuff and being like, yeah, let's, like, what do you think? And if you don't like it, like, how can we figure out how to make it better? So if you could just speak to that type of process.
Yeah. It's so funny because some people would listen to their full interviews and be like, great, use it all, whatever, I don't care. And I was like, oh, thank God. but some people were like, had like 50 edits to share with me on like a 10-minute collection of clips. It was just kind of like, oh my God, the next episode's coming out. I really need to get your approval on this. And one thing that really, really helped, and I don't know if this is like necessarily useful for your process, but once I made little trailers for the oral history, the trust just went through the roof. Like I made 5 little teasers and they all centered on different like aspects of the story. Like one was like, oh, here's a teaser to let everyone know that there will be leaked audio in this. Here's a teaser to let everyone know that there will be like one-on-one conversations in this, just like little aspects of it. And once people heard like how the story was told and how the quality of the production, like the like tone of my voice, like all those things really just help people go, okay, you're going to use my clips in a good way. So yeah, if there's any way that you can sort of share a sample of what you're working on with someone that you're trying to negotiate with, I think that would help. Yeah. I don't know if you can do it though.
Yeah, I mean, it's so complicated, especially, I'm interested to hear that people were still in like needing to hear more from you about how you were going to use it. And that makes me think about like what your relationship was with them beforehand. Cause I think the thing that I've encountered is people are like, do whatever, like, I don't need to see it, like, go for it. And I'm so grateful for that, but it actually makes me more stressed out because I'm like, I want you to look at this. And that's for people I know, right? And I think generally it's so not okay to send things to folks ahead of time and reporting specifically, or like under only special circumstances. So it's just, I think hearing about all this is making me think like, what a relief it would be to be able to offer that much agency to the people that are participating. And I'm sure it gets frustrating, right? It's like too many cooks in the kitchen, but also I'm like, it just seems very like the most ethical way to do this kind of thing. But you're also getting into things about power, right? Like you wouldn't do that for somebody. Well, obviously you didn't include anti-union voices, but like, it's a fine line to decide like, oh, when do I become the arbiter of like who gets to decide these things? And like, and that's why it's like sort of nice to never do that in reporting, because then you don't run into those issues. But it just means that like we're not engaging thoughtfully often.
Yeah.
Well, Jenny, is that because you like Jenny does really interesting work about thinking about how to make reporting more inclusive, but then also like we have to like work in structures that do kind of extractive journalism. So I wonder if is there a way of trying to incorporate some of what Clarissa talks about into models that are more like locked down and extractive? Or is there just not time or permission to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that I've been thinking about it too, and maybe Clarissa, this is a question for you about like the editing process, but often like things just are out of my hands. And like, so I need to, often it's like the farce of, oh, this is my story because my voice is on it. But truthfully, it's been like 6 people who have their hands on it and are making decisions about it. And it becomes like a collaborative process more than it is like, I decide, you know, because like if it were me, I would be like, well, I choose who has the ability to like check their quotes, not cops, not mayors, not, you know, all these people.
Yeah.
But like it gets sticky. It
Yeah.
definitely gets sticky. But like, did you have that ever where, I mean, you said you had some pushback about how you told the story, but like, yeah, just having other people control sort of how it comes out.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like, yeah, I definitely tried because there were some moments that I knew were very sensitive for people.
Mhm.
And even though they gave me the green light, they were like, yeah, use it, whatever, I'm excited. I was still like, people are going to know you said this, they know your voice, your name's going to be on the script, even though we just use first names still. And I would check in several times. I would be like, hey, you know, here's what the script looks like. Will you take a look at your section? You know, like, are you absolutely sure I can use this? You know, like I would sort of just prime them for that, because the worst thing, I think one of the worst things that could happen for the integrity of this oral history, or just like the outward perception of it, is if one of my participants said like, you know, my voice was used without my permission, or that's going to ruin my career or something like that. And like, not only do I just not want that to happen because I care about all these people, but I also didn't want it to bring down the story too, because I think it's just an important story. But there was actually one, I mean, there have been several things. First, we started out thinking we were going to name all the managers, which we ended up not doing. Partially because participants were like, oh, I don't know how I feel about that. And I didn't want them to regret being part of this project. So I decided not to use the names of anyone except the CEO, who's like easily searchable. So, but another like situation that had me kind of like on the fence was in one of the episodes, we share leaked audio from a conversation between the head of like PR and comms at Kickstarter and a reporter who was also a creator that was like an activist in favor of the union. So he recorded their conversation and he shared that with me. And just the way that this person conducted himself in that conversation was so important for people to hear. It was so important to hear what companies are saying when they think no one's listening, you know? And he like cast doubt on the organizers' firings and said like, you know, tech doesn't need unions, or who knows if tech is going to unionize, just all these things that the company would never say publicly. And I felt conflicted because I knew that this person in management didn't know he was being recorded, obviously, like most people who were recorded. But I also felt like he wasn't one of the main actors in union busting, even though one of his main jobs was to undermine the union effort publicly through PR. That was his job. And we were kind of friends whenever I worked at Kickstarter, and it just like, it all felt really scary to do, but it just came down to like, what is the most helpful to other workers? And I just had to include it because I knew it would be useful for other workers to hear that disconnect of what the company is saying publicly, saying we support unions, and what they're saying privately to journalists who are shaping those stories. So yeah, it was a tough one.
So then how are participants feeling about the project so far, having listened to so many episodes?
Yeah, I think they love it. I do. I get so many messages every day and like voicemails of people just like crying, like saying that they, you know, because so many of us like went through like real like challenges psychologically through this experience, and it was really intense. And to have our stories like captured in a way that honors our experiences is so powerful. Like it felt like something that would never happen, and it's just been amazing to have this opportunity to capture everything that happened from the perspective of the organizers. Yeah, because so much of the time we have to read our own experiences in articles told by people who weren't there and also shaped by the company. And yeah, it's just nice to actually hear how it really felt in the moment.
Yeah, because there's the factual stuff there, there's the like how organizing happens, the current political moment, like there's so much wrapped up in it that it must be gratifying to have this like body of work that's documenting your experience.
Yeah. And not only that, like other workers from other companies that I don't like, strangers have reached out to me and said, oh my God, like this is just like my experience. I can't believe it. Like I didn't know other people experience that, or I feel so seen, or, you know, I get messages like that all the time too. And one person even said that she joined the organizing committee because of the podcast. Like she was so inspired by the work of, you know, my fellow organizers that she decided to like really get involved in her own union drive. And that was also like really exciting. And yeah.
Same. Yeah. I listened to this. I was like, oh, there's an adjunct teachers union that I should be involved with. Let me get on that. This is very
exciting.
Amazing. Because you also use, I think importantly, like the word like corroboration, like in how the different people you talk to corroborate one another's experience. So it's happening at the level of where Kickstarter was, but then also I think like you're speaking to more generally, it's happening with people trying to organize unions in a lot of different places. So
yeah.
Well, I've kept you talking for so long. Is there anything we didn't cover that you want to make sure that we do cover?
I think one thing that if anyone like listening to this or however this gets shared or whatever, like is or even like even Jenny, if like if this helps you in any way. One thing that I definitely kept in mind was something I mentioned before about like trying to make this oral history in a way where people can identify with the people doing this work. Especially in tech, like a lot of tech workers have never really had that much interaction with someone who is like currently in a union or has been a major player in a union drive. And I just like tried so hard to make us all like seem like the humans we are, you know? And it's so funny because some people who participated were like, oh, I say the word like so many times in this clip. And I was like, but that's fine. Like if people need to know that you're just like them. And yeah, I just thought that was like, I think it really paid off in the end, because I think a lot of people do see themselves in the organizers. So.
Yeah, because I was thinking about, again, when I was taking notes on this, I was like, well, who are the characters? And I was like, actually, there aren't characters. Like nobody's really an archetype for anything. People are very distinct and unique in the way that they are expressing themselves and how they perceive the events that were going on. And I think, you know, that's down to like who they are as people, but also to your relationship with them in interviewing. So
yeah.
Well, I'm going to stop recording now. This is when the good stuff's going to happen. I don't even know how to stop.